Welcome to another episode of the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today we're stepping into the world of baseball royalty, larger than life personalities, family legacy, and one of the most fascinating ownership stories in sports history. Our guest is Mike Vaccaro, one of New York's most respected sports journalists and longtime columnist for the New York Post. In his new book, The Bosses of the Bronx, The Endless Drama of the Yankees Under the House of Steinbrenner, Mike takes readers behind the curtain of the most famous franchise in American sports and the family that has shaped its destiny for more than 50 years. From George Steinbrenner's fiery reign as the boss to Hal Steinbrenner's challenge of leading in his father's enormous shadow. This book is packed with triumph, controversy, comedy, and unforgettable baseball history. Mike Vaccaro, happy to have here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here with you.
So what
As I
first
said, when I came on the call, I like the product placement, so appreciate that.
What first inspired you to tell the story of the Yankees through the lens of the Steinbrenner family rather than simply as a team history?
I think Steinbrenner is such a larger than life character. Such a multifaceted character. So much good, so much bad, so much in between. Over the course of his 37-year tenure as the owner, and Hal's inherited a lot of that, even though he's not anywhere close personality-wise to the man his father is. I mean, which I would say is probably for the good, certainly in 2026. Um, but it's interesting because I think a lot of people forget the other aspects of George. Either the younger crowd just wasn't around when George was at his apex, and even those guys who are our generation, Steve, I think a lot of times use selective amnesia and chooses just remember George toward the end when he was a kindly, wildly popular man who would walk into Yankee Stadium and just be buried in cheers. And of course, guys like you and me are old enough to remember that 10 years before that, he would walk into the same ballpark and hear a lot of noise, but it was a lot different kind of noise and a lot different selection of words that was being shouted at him. And to me, that's what makes him so endlessly fascinating as a character, which makes the Steinbrenner family and their, now 52-year ownership, 53-year ownership with the Yankees, even more fascinating to me.
Yeah, this brought back so many memories for me growing up in New York there in the late 70s and all the drama, the Bronx Zoo, everything going on with the Yankees. Steinbrenner has been written about extensively over the years, Mike. What new perspective were you hoping to bring to readers here?
I think I was trying to tell maybe some old familiar stories that maybe might not be so familiar anymore. And even if they were familiar, maybe try and find a different way to tell them than had been told before. At least judging from what a lot of people have said, I think I'm grateful to hear that. I think I might have pulled off what I wanted to. Because look, a lot of these stories, yeah, sometimes you get lost in it because there was just so many of them. I
Yeah.
mean, life around the boss was a tilt-a-whirl from hell almost because I mean, you had a big story every day. You thought the entire world was going to melt on a Wednesday around George, and then all of a sudden you have Thursday, and that made you forget Wednesday. That's just what it was like covering him. It was like that's what it was like. I think being a fan of the Yankees in those years. Certainly, what it was like playing for him, especially during the long years in between championships, when a lot of times George would sabotage his own very best teams by getting too involved and meddling and firing people who shouldn't be fired and trading people who shouldn't have been traded and doing things like one time walking into the clubhouse and announcing to Lou Piniella, "I've just won you the pennant." And when he told him how, he said, "I just got you Steve Trout." And needless to say, Steve Trout didn't save the Yankees, Lou Piniella, or George Steinbrenner that year. But it did give us all, one good story of a lifetime of ownership of the Yankees, which produced thousands of great stories.
Steinbrenner became one of the most recognizable owners in sports history. What do you think people misunderstand most about him?
Look, I think what you have to really remember about George, and this I think was one of the things that I've either forgotten or just never really knew, was that he was really primarily responsible for the fact that they still are the New York Yankees, that they aren't the New Jersey Yankees, that they aren't
Yeah.
the New Orleans Yankees, because that was a possibility in those years. A lot of people saw that the Yankees had one foot out the door. They were just going to follow the Giants, out of Yankee Stadium, out of a crumbling stadium, out of a shaky neighborhood, and just moved to North Jersey, which seemed like paradise for the Giants and has been, let's face it. Um, but one of the things that appealed to William Paley, the chairman of CBS, was the fact that Steinbrenner, who was a minority investor in his group. I mean, he only put up about $168,000 of his own money, which they'll be teaching about in business school, 500 years from now. Um, but they weren't the highest bidder for the team. I mean, there were a couple of other bids. Lehman Brothers was a good $3 or $4 million more north of what the Steinbrenner Group was offering, but they made no bones about the fact that they very much might move the team to Jersey, and in fact probably would have. Paley was already realized that part of his obituary was going to be ruined because he was going to have to be referred to as the guy who'd allowed the Yankees to crumble after so many decades of dynasty. But he didn't also want to be known as the guy who helped foster their departure from New York. And when Steinbrenner was adamant about wanting to keep the team in New York, that was really the selling point to Paley, who just happened to like Steinbrenner, liked what he brought, liked his moxie and the word of the day. And so that's who he agreed to sell the team to. And it's really an amazing success story when you think about it. If Lehman Brothers had brought the team, they'd already decided that Herman Franks, an old New York Giants player manager, was going to run the baseball operations, and he had already agreed to get his manager. And his manager was a guy by the name of Willie Mays, and that could have changed a lot of local history in a lot of ways, because Willie wouldn't have played in '73 for the Mets then, and Frank Robinson wouldn't have been the first African American manager, and who knows if Willie Mays would have been a good manager or not. But certainly the arc of his career would have been different because he would have been involved from baseball directly in a way he really never was. And then, ultimately he spent some time away from the game because of it. So there's a real sliding doors moment there. And George, prevented those doors from sliding too much because he got the team, he kept them in New York, he committed to New York, he embraced the Yankees, even though they were a depressed asset, because he believed in the power of New York City. He believed in the brand that the Yankees were. He couldn't have possibly known that, in 2008, when I was wandering around Beijing covering the Olympics, I'd see hundreds of Yankees caps. And it's not because, they get the Yes Network or MLB Network in Beijing, but people know everywhere in the world, they know what the Yankees are, who the Yankees are, even if they don't necessarily root for the Yankees. And George realized right away that that was going to be one of the big assets that he was buying into. And starting on January 3rd, 1973, it was all his.
Throughout your research, Mike, was there a particular Steinbrenner story that surprised you, even after years of covering New York sports?
Well, the one I just talked about him being the guy who basically saved the Yankees from leaving New York,
Yeah.
wasn't one I was really familiar with. I mean, I think the other ones, I think that people just thought of him as being a shoot first, worry about the questions later. Even early in his time when he was kind of starting the whole notion of what free agency could be, and obviously he signed a couple of the big ticket early free agents and Catfish Hunter and Reggie Jackson and Goose Gossage. Even then, he realized that it was unsustainable, even for the Yankees, to just rely on, signing somebody else's great player every year. That you had to build an infrastructure, you had to build a farm system, you had to hire the best scouts and let them do their jobs. And so he was committed to it. He threw a lot of money at that long before any other team did. And in that way, he almost seems like a groundbreaking figure. But the problem is that he also shared an office with another guy named George Steinbrenner. And that version of Steinbrenner was impatient. He was impetuous. He would trade Jay Buhner for Ken Phelps, and to the everlasting chagrin of Frank Costanza and many others. And that was the George that usually carried the day. That was the version of George's voice that too often carried the day. But he really had the best intentions and was really, in a lot of ways, decades ahead of his time. I'm not going to say that George Steinbrenner invented Moneyball, not by any stretch, unless you want to redefine what Moneyball means. But he had the idea that, you couldn't just buy a team every year. He didn't much care for the idea the Yankees were considered the best team money could buy, even though it was true. But he realized you had to augment those superstar players with a foundation of your own players. He just never was able to keep at it, and the Yankees suffered for a lot of years because of it.
The book touches on moments when Steinbrenner's behavior led to his suspension from baseball. How did those episodes ultimately affect the franchise?
Yeah, that's the great thing, right, Steve? I mean, it's not just suspension, it's plural, 2 suspensions.
Yeah.
And the fact is, I mean, look, I didn't write this book with the intention of trying to diminish what George Steinbrenner did in 37 years of ownership. And I don't think I or anybody else could do that even if that was our intention. And I think that he did a lot more good than bad in terms of, making the Yankees what they are. However, it's also a matter of record that the Yankees built two separate eras of prosperity, mostly because George was out of the picture. He had suspended the first time for being part of the illegal campaign contributions with the Nixon campaign. And so he sat out the 74 and 75 seasons. And while he was sitting out, Gabe Paul was able to build the bones of a championship team in his absence. George was consulted on things like signing Catfish Hunter because it was own money, and even the commissioner was willing to let him do that. But it was Gabe Paul who basically built that team without any kind of interruption from George. The only one that really, got in the way while he was out of baseball was George was adamant that he wanted Gabe Paul to at least make a play for Billy Martin. And of course, that happened in the summer of 75. Later on, same thing. He's thrown out of baseball the second time for basically trying to blackmail his best player, Dave Winfield, and hiring a low-level gambler to, do his dirty work for him. That's a whole other story. But, while he was out, Gene Michael was able to do the same thing. And the Yankees were in a lot worse shape when Michael took over. They were a last place team. They were a mess, but they had a couple of players, and they drafted a few more while he was in charge and George was out. And there's no question in my mind that if George were the guy running, calling the shots in those days, that at least one or two of the guys that we now know as the core four plus Bernie Williams, at least one or two of those guys would have been playing the bulk of their careers elsewhere. And look, they might have had enough to be able to still win one or two. They certainly wouldn't have won the five they won between 1996 and 2009. And I think that's pretty clear. And I think that all the flowers that the late Gene Michael, has gotten since then, he deserves. He was more than happy to welcome those flowers, and he should be, because he was responsible for the creation of the modern Yankees, which is it's still pretty much the textbook that we have now. People have problem with Brian Cashman. That's fine. But Brian Cashman learned at the foot of stick. And really, a lot of what he does today is still things that he was inspired by working so closely with Gene Michael.
You mentioned Billy Martin earlier. Steinbrenner's feuds with managers became legendary. Which manager-owner relationship best illustrates who Steinbrenner really was throughout all of them?
Well, the Martin one, for sure. Yeah. Because, look, I mean, he hired Billy Martin 5 times. He fired him 5 times. He never once fired him because the product on the field had grown lousy. It was all because Billy had done this or Billy had done that. Billy called him a liar and convicted him and Reggie Martin, him and Reggie Jackson rather. Or he got into a bar fight with a marshmallow salesman in Minneapolis. I mean, think about that for a second, right? And just on and on. I mean, that's the reason why Billy kept getting fired. He was never fired because his baseball team was going sideways. It was because he had gone sideways. But George was always attracted to him. They always circled each other. A couple of those firings really hurt Billy deeply, and he would say, "I'm never going to wear these pinstripes again." And inevitably, the Yankees would get into trouble. They need a strong voice, and George knew who he wanted to turn to. And there's no question to anybody who was around then that if Billy Martin hadn't died tragically on Christmas Day, 1989, that he probably would have been brought back before Memorial Day in 1990, because the Yankees were in trouble. They wound up being in trouble. Manager got fired, and Billy would have been the easy call, and he might have done that 1 or 2 other times also. Which is why people ask me, what would George have done about Aaron Boone? I say, well, there's a great chance if George were around, Aaron Boone would be the manager. He'd just be on like his 3rd tenure right now, because that's what he should do. And when it wasn't just Billy he did that with. I mean, he fired and hired Bob Lemon twice. He did the same thing with Gene Michael twice. Clyde King a couple of times. I mean, he did that a lot. If Dick Hauser had survived, I guarantee you, he probably would have been rehired at some point when he was done with the Royals. I mean, Lou Piniella, on and on. That was George's playbook.
Hauser was one of his regrets, right?
He said he had 2 big regrets. It's his 2 big regrets when for all of his time owning the Yankees. One of them was letting Reggie Jackson depart via free agency. Always regretted that. Thought that the problem was that he correctly, along with his baseball cabinet, saw that Reggie probably had one more great year, one more good year, and then a bunch of like aging slugger years, which is kind of exactly how it played out for Reggie in California and later on in Oakland when he finished out his career. But the Yankees weren't ready to be done with the Reggie era. I mean, they missed him as soon as he was gone. Famously, he had a home run his first time back in Yankee Stadium, and the stadium turned on Steinbrenner, which was one of the lowlights of his tenure there. And the other one, of course, was Hauser, who he forced out after 1980. It was kind of an early preview for what he did later on with Buck Showalter, where he basically said he wanted to have him to fire all of his coaches. And Hauser, like Showalter years later, said, "George, if you're going to do that, you might as well just fire me." And George said, "Okay," and so he did. And so yeah, and he realized like he tried right away to hire Buck back. He waited a year or two. He always figured that Dick would come back to him at some point because he'd been with the Yankees for so many years. But before he could actually make that move, the Royals hired him, and before he knew it, the Royals were winning the World Series championship. And Hauser had been one of the several guys who wound up thriving outside the orbit of Steinbrenner. Of course, Lou Piniella did the same thing with the Reds in 1990. So, but yeah, he always regretted that. He had some other moves that he wished he might have gotten differently, but those are the two fundamental benchmarks in his tenure that he wished he would have had a mulligan for.
Hal Steinbrenner, Mike. Was Hal prepared for the enormous expectations that came with inheriting baseball's most famous franchise?
Yeah, he couldn't possibly have been more prepared than Hal was. He knew who his father was. He knows now who his father was. He knew what people expected out of George. But look, I mean, Hal impressed his father at an early age. I have the story in the book. When he was 12 years old, Burger King had a promotion where they had a bunch of baseball cards for the Yankees. You buy your Whopper and you get a couple of Yankees cards. And it was Hal, age 12, who realized that for some reason they had all these Yankees, but they didn't have Lou Piniella. And he told his father, and obviously Lou Piniella was very close to George. If there was one employee that George got closer to than anybody else in his time there, it was Piniella. And so he made a point, Hal did, of telling his father, and his father basically called Burger King and made him a very simple offer: either you create a Lou Piniella card and you start adding it now, or we'll see you in court. And of course, Burger King didn't want to fight the Yankees, so they did that. They only made about 5,000 of them, so they're kind of on the collector's item. If you have a Burger King circa 1980 or 79 card for Lou Piniella, I mean, you might want to see what that's worth on eBay. Hal actually has one. He has one laminated, and he showed that to me while I was doing the book, and that tells you a little bit about what Hal was even when he was 12, 13 years old. George saw that, liked it. I think he realized that Hal temperamentally was better suited for the job than Hank, his older son, was. Sadly, Hank died in 2020, but Hank spent the company about a year and a half, 2 years as the forward-looking voice of the operation, and liked it for a little bit. Then he tired of it because he just didn't have the stomach that his father had for being in the headlines every day. Hal was really perfectly temperamentally suited for the job, and also understood that because his father had won those 5 championships, recently and 7 overall, he was always going to be, probably, judged against him, and he has been, and he continues to be. And there was a loud segment of Yankees fans. They've already lost, 4 games in a row, 5 games in a row this year. I hear from them no matter how well they're doing otherwise. What would George do? And like I always tell them, I said, if you want to go back to between 1978 and 1996, that's what you got with George for a large segment of time. And that's actually longer than this drought they're suffering through, going back to 2009. So yeah, George knew exactly who he was dating as his replacement, and I think he'd be very happy because, look, business is thriving. The family is ensconced in the ownership there. People always ask Hal, when he's going to sell, because obviously, I mean, he can get 8, 9, $10 billion for it, which means like his great 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 grandchildren will never have to work a day in their lives they don't want to. And he said, "Why would we sell? That's our family store. That's our corner store." And they seem really committed to that and are very serious about that.
Why do you think George was so close to Lou Piniella?
Lou was a Tampa guy, so that helped. I mean, George became a Tampa resident. Probably in his mid 40s, early 50s, he became, and once he moved full time to Tampa, he was Mr. Tampa, and so Lou had those ties, so they had that connection in common. That was a huge deal. And so, and just they got along well. George didn't demand complete fealty. I mean, he liked guys who would break his chops. He liked guys. I mean, one of the reasons he loved those teams in the '70s is because he had a bunch of guys who would throw punches back with him, in person on the back page. I mean, Goose Gossett was never afraid to get in George's face. Neither was Thurman Munson. Obviously, Reggie Jackson, loved it. Billy Martin lived for it. Later on, that was kind of missing, right? Because nobody really wanted to get into a back page war with Bernie Williams or Andy Pettit. I mean,
Yeah.
who would? Even we didn't want that because who's going to want to read a story like that? So the personalities changed, but Pinello was right there with those guys. He used to love to needle George, right to his face, and George needled him right back. You know, there's a funny story about Pinello showing up one year with long hair, and Steinbrenner saying, you got to cut that. And Lou said, you know what? Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ had hair that was longer than this. And George pointed to the lake out front in front of the Yankee Stadium. He said, "Go out and walk on that water, and you can keep your hair the way it is." That's just the kind of banter. That's the kind of relationship they had, and so he liked that. They had some falling outs over time. Obviously, they kept getting fired like everybody else. Later on, while George was having his problems with Fay Vincent and Howie Spira, he hinted that Lou might have a gambling problem, which he really didn't. Lou liked to gamble, but I don't had a gambling problem. There is a difference there, and Lou did really took offense to that. I do think they mended fences after that, but that caused kind of a rift for a couple of years. But yeah, that was definitely his favorite. He had others. I mean, he was very close to Bobby Mercer. He was very close to Munson, especially toward the end. One of the things I didn't know that I found out later on doing this book is that, a day or two before Munson's plane crash, him and Gabe Paul, who had left the Yankees to be the GM of the Indians by then, had kind of agreed, let's, at some point, either later in the season or in the offseason, let's make Thurman happy and send him to Cleveland. I mean, the Yankees were ready to move on. Thurman badly wanted to play in Cleveland, which was close
Yeah.
to his home. And but obviously circumstances got in the way. So he was close to Thurman too. And he's been very happy. Look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that he was never closer with Billy Martin than on the day he died. I mean, they got along famous. They always got along fine when he wasn't working for him. That was the case with a
Yeah.
lot of guys who worked for George. But he and look, the thing of it is, there were a lot of players who went 15 rounds with George. George was good to them later on. If they fell on hard times, they just needed a job, or they wanted to have a connection to baseball, he'd bring him back and make him a spring training coach, and not out of pity, but out of a sense of loyalty. He was fiercely loyal, and that's it's hard when you come across older ball players. It's hard for them ever to say a bad thing about George because what they remember is that George was good to them when they needed someone to stand up and say, "Here's a friend." And so no matter how many wars they went after, they usually were able to kind of settle their own score in their own mind and their own heart with George.
What is next for you in your writing, Mike? Are there other sports stories or historical subjects you'd like to explore in future books?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've just agreed in principle to do a book about New York in the '80s, focusing heavily on sports, but also New York in those years was just the center of a lot of music, a lot of movies, a lot of pop culture, and a lot of times the sports figures of New York and the pop culture kind of intertwined. And so I'm going to do a little exploration of that. I'm going to start working on that hopefully once the Knicks run is over, and I'm looking forward to that. It's a little different departure for me. It's not going to be strictly a sports book. I've dabbled a little bit in past books where I've gone into an historical element of it. So that's going to be fun, I think.
Can't wait for that one. I came up in the 80s in New York, and of course,
There you
my
go.
Mets winning the World
You and me
Series in
both,
'86.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So can't wait for that one. I'll ask you real quick here. I think the Knicks have a great chance against San Antonio.
I do too. Look, I mean, everyone was talking about the Knicks' easy path, which is silly. Since 2022, I think was the last time an eventual champion had to defeat a one seed, and that was when the Warriors knocked off the Celtics, who were a one seed. You play who you play, and the fact that they didn't get to play the Celtics and the Pistons, well, shame on the Pistons and the Celtics because they didn't
Yep.
get there.
Yeah.
And it's just you look at the way they played the 11 games leading into game one. It's just remarkable. We've never seen 11 games like that in the history of the sport. I mean, you would imagine logically that level of play can't be kept up forever. Can it be kept up but long enough for them to get four more wins? I mean, I think it can be. I think the Spurs are a fascinating team. I think, look, Wembanyama is as
No.
close to a unicorn. I know his nickname isn't unicorn, it's alien, but same idea. And he's going to be there. He's going to be hard. He's got a great supporting cast of characters. Dylan Harper grew up around here. People are familiar with him, and he's just something to watch. He's going to be something to hold, in the years to come. But it's going to be a fascinating series. I think it's going to be a long series. I'm looking forward to covering it.
Oh, these are it's clearly the two best teams in the league. And I was thinking recently, back to the Patrick Ewing Knicks. These Knicks, I'm not used to them blowing out teams in the playoffs. It was always a struggle back then.
The Knicks always put you through a torture chamber. A
Yes.
lot of times it means that it's going to finish you off for the basketball season, like last year when Halliburton made a shot. The Knicks blew that game in game one and ultimately wound up losing the series. Or you can talk about, even 94, all their preliminary, well, the two of their preliminary series went to seven and the finals
Yeah.
went seven. I mean, you were just, you pull your hair out.
Yeah.
Even when they went to game seven of the finals. This is different. I wrote a column last week about, how rare it is for especially around New York for teams to be just this to where, the kind of stress free. If you're looking at it from a fan standpoint, how you're just not rocking back and forth and, and going into lucky positions and wearing lucky hats. You just don't need them because they've been that good. The last one around here we saw that was like that was probably the Yankees in 98, 99,
Yeah.
99. They weren't as good a regular season team, but they went 11-1 in the postseason and were just dominant. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing now.
Yeah. Mike Vaccaro's new book is The Bosses of the Bronx, The Endless Drama of the Yankees Under the House of Steinbrenner. It's available now wherever books are sold. It's a fascinating look at the family that transformed the Yankees into a modern sports empire and the larger-than-life personalities who made baseball history along the way, too. Mike, thank you so much for joining me.
Steve, it's great talking to you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. And thank you for watching and for listening. And don't forget to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Steve Richards. I will talk to you again next time.